I'm gonna mute everyone. David, Rachel, and Michelle, I have you muted so you can unmute yourselves when we're chatting. Welcome everyone. Very, very excited to see you today. This has been a very popular webinar we've been inviting folks to over the last week. I'm Rachel. I am the CEO and co-founder of Opus Training. And Fireside Chats are something that we've been doing for several months now as a way to really continue to help connect people in the food industry and beyond. This is obviously a world that we're all very used to staying connected, and these fireside chats have been a really amazing way to do so. They're very informal. We tend to invite speakers who we know can offer a unique perspective. And so the people that we have here today, I'm extremely excited to put them on stage. We'll do some quick introductions and then we're just gonna dive in. And so everyone knows in the audience right now watching, check your chat in Zoom. We're gonna be sending you resources as everyone's speaking. We're pretty fast at listening in and pulling in a resource if we need to. So be sure to check that chat. And then if you ever have a question for the panelists, rather than unmuting yourself, it's a little bit more efficient to just throw it into the chat. You're welcome to direct message me if you'd like to. My DMs are open, as they say. You're also welcome to just throw it into the public chat, and I will be sure to get to it, either if it's relevant now or if we'll save it till the end. But we track all of that. So the point of this is that everybody should have a voice. Everybody should be able to ask questions for our esteemed panelists. I know that they're eager to get your questions as well, and we'll definitely make sure to hear you. But let's talk about who we have on the panel here. You all heard about me. Opus, just very briefly, is a company. We are a software company specifically for the food industry that builds training and engagement technology for frontline workers. We are on a humble mission to build the most accessible platform for frontline teams on the planet. And so because of that, we really like to take a lot of time with the food community to stay connected and to learn and make sure that we're building the best thing possible. But I'm gonna toss it to the panel to just talk a little bit about what their title, say your name, say your title, say where you work, and then I'd love just a quick intro question. What is the last book or article that you read that you really loved? So we'll do that quick intro and then we're gonna dive in. David Hyatt, I'm gonna start with you.
Okay, great. So David Hyatt, Chief People Officer, Ruth's Hospitality Group, better known as Ruth's Chris. Last book that I read that I really loved, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa Feldman. Absolutely fantastic. And I've got a tie. The other one is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday.
I've heard about that one. That one's on my list.
It's a good one. It's worth it.
I guess I have to read it now.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Yep.
Michelle, I'm gonna toss it to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Jagroop. I'm the VP of HR at Paris Baguette, America. And the last article that I actually read that I really love, I tend to read these Forbes.com articles, was What Are the CEOs of Tomorrow Doing Today? I thought it was a really impactful read. So I'd like to share that one. I think I got all your questions, right?
You got it. I'm going to toss it to you, Rachel.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rachael Kelly. I'm the CHRO for Smokey Bones based in Aventura, Florida. My last favorite book that I read that actually I read fairly frequently is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. That's one of my all-time favorites. Important to reconnect to that.
Yeah, we're going to have to share a book list after this. This is the first time I've asked this question, and I officially need to, maybe we'll throw something up onto our blog. Well, let's get started. So everyone here knows that the topic of the conversation is how has the role of Chief People Officer, of executive HR leader in the restaurant world evolved? We're obviously in a different world today, both in the industry and globally. This is an incredibly important topic. Your roles are central to organizations, and I think there's a lot of mystery behind it. I think a lot of people don't know what you do every day, and so I want to start a little bit and backtrack. Really quickly, let's talk about why you got into this business. Why did you get into the business of human resources? We don't necessarily have to go the whole pathway to know if this was something that you have always mapped out. Did you kind of go through the step ladder up to the top, or was it more of a winding road? Michelle, I'm going to start with you. Why did you get into HR?
Actually, I wanted to be a psychiatrist. That was my kind of goal when I was in college, until I did physics and chemistry. And I'm like, okay, well, med school's not for me. And I'd actually minored in organizational psychology and had really found it interesting, and won an award for from the professor who ran that program. And so I kind of then veered off into the pathway of HR, and, started off as an HR assistant, and really have progressively worked my way up into, kind of multiple areas of HR, doing generalist work, employee relations, recruiting. And so I've kind of had a very progressive and lucky exposure to different parts of the industry and retail as well, front of house, back of house, logistics, design, merchandising and design. So it's been an interesting career path, but I would say very kind of progressive in my growth to be able to layer on to get to the point that I am at now, which has been really helpful for me, I think, to be able to pull on all those experiences to then, be impactful in the role that I'm in now.
And that makes me think about you, Rachel.
I kind of do the work with no prescriptions, is what I say.
Which is, we know this pathway. We've hear it so often, and especially the background of HR leaders. There's a lot of retail in there. There's public companies, there's private companies. Rachel, I know you have some experience with this. How'd you get to where you are?
I began my career path as a pizza cook. So I loved the industry because I loved the vibe. I loved the energy. And fundamentally, I loved that in our industry, it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, or where you come from. It is about your performance and your ability to learn and grow and take on challenges, and you can go anywhere. And I was really lucky to be with a company that valued that. And so I was able to work through the system a lot in operations, and I would bounce kind of as I was learning different aspects of the organization. I would bounce between ops and HR in kind of progressing roles, both field side, corporate side, franchisee side, company side. And then, in my last public company, I decided to take a leap into a very entrepreneurial space because I really loved the entrepreneurial pace and just environment. And that's when I jumped into a startup and then ultimately into private equity.
So just a straight, clear path there.
Oh, yeah.
David, how about you?
So I would say probably an extraordinarily long and winding road to get here. So I think, back in 1983, and I will not bore you with the trajectory since 1983, but my parents actually got me into the hospitality industry when they were convinced that as a psychology major in college, I was never going to find gainful employment. So they bought me bartending lessons for Christmas one year and fell in love with the industry. And so have been, then, went off to a variety of things. And I'm kind of a escaped academic. So did time teaching in a master's program in industrial psychology, which is what my background is. And then really came from the outside of the industry, working more as a consultant. So I had the opportunity to work with some phenomenal brands, got to work with Outback Steakhouse and Carrabba's and Bonefish and that whole family, really being a consultant to the operations. So like Rachel has said and Michelle has said, you get infected with the operations bug, right? Of really understanding how does it work and the importance of operations. And so really came from that side of outside of the industry and consulting into the industry. And then when the opportunity to join Ruth's, who I'd done some work with in 2009, 2010, it's like the opportunity to go home and, love the people, love the brands, and just said, sure, why not? Go inside for a while.
So this is actually a great transition to a question I'm very eager to ask. David, I'm actually going to throw it back to you here. When we think about the definition of CPO, Chief People Officer, the other name we hear a lot is CHRO. Yep. They're kind of synonymous in many roles. This role is important in helping companies navigate the workforce issues associated with expansion into new markets, with developing labor policies to suit different geographic regions, with preserving core company culture. It's a very cross-functional position, more so, I would argue, than it was 10 years ago. David, what common misconceptions do people have about the role of a CPO?
I think you already nailed it, Rachel, from in my experience, right? So I don't have all the wisdom in the world on this, but I think it is really, it's the misconception is that it's as broad as it is, right? So I think to your point about another name is CHRO, is thinking about it as it's, and I'm going to say just, and it's not to demean HR, but it's just an HR function, right? But it's not, it's a strategy function. It's a brand function. It's an operations function. It's a finance function, right? And so, as I would argue that the true CPO that's really going to make a difference, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, is the ability to look across all parts of the business, because we touch them all. And if you're not touching all of them, then you're missing some. Right. And I think that's, what I've been hearing for 30 odd years is HR is looking for a seat at the table. Right. Well, as a CPO, you have the seat at the table. Right. And you really need to take advantage of it. In my opinion, that's the way that I look at it.
Yeah. Curious to hear if Rachel and Michelle have anything to add to that.
I would 100% agree with David. I feel exactly the same way. I think, one good example I would use to really showcase what I've even heard from people I interact with a lot of times, I'm involved in the recruiting process and all of our, senior level talent that we are bringing into our company. And I hear it time and time again. I'll have people tell me, like, have you worked in supply chain? Have you worked in, finance? Have you worked in this area? Have you worked in ops? Because I've never met an HR professional who seems to have such a clear understanding of the business that like you do. Or, it's clear that you're so passionate about the company and how it works, and you can describe all the intricacies of the operations. And I think, that to me sometimes is the misconception, right? That you meet talent that thinks of HR in a different lens. They seem surprised when you know about the business and all the parts of the business and how they work together. And I feel really strongly that that's where HR adds tremendous value, to be able to connect the dots and really look at it from a broad lens and be able to help pull, the pieces of how that works together so that you can continue to support all the pieces of the organization. But I do find that to be the biggest misconception of, kind of people who you interact with. They don't see HR necessarily as that's the first part I think of when I think about HR leadership.
Yeah, and I would agree. The analogy I like to, or I picture in my head, is it's a little bit like the company is the operation of the company is the mill in a water mill, and a really effective CPO is driving, is like pouring the water, driving the wheel to go faster and faster and faster to achieve the strategic plan. We are a strategic partner, guiding and driving the energy and finding the way, where's their dissonance, where's their dysfunction, how do we break that, but driving the overall effectiveness of the organization to achieve the strategic targets. That is the role, in my mind, of a CPO.
Okay, let's dig in then, because we need to talk about the elephant in the room here, which is one of the biggest strategies that every restaurant, we have a few restaurant owners on this webinar right now. I see Ale from Avocadoria there, folks who are building big fast casual brands. Safety has the definition of safety has completely changed over the last 365 days. I think what I would like to hear first is if anyone can chime in here and just tell us a little bit about your role over the last year as it has pertained to COVID safety in particular, but then feel welcome to stretch beyond that. We were talking about some other forms of safety a little bit earlier. Maybe Rachel, I'll toss it to you first to start.
Sure. Yeah. I think, this year, what we saw with COVID was how incredibly important, right, the safety of our employees and our guests were when you're continuing to operate, and ensuring that people were safe and that they felt safe. So it's both, to me, it was both the physical safety, the health safety, and also the psychological safety, especially with all of this, the things that were happening in our society in this past year. So to me, the CPO, our role has been a lot to lead those initiatives, to partner with the operations team and the rest of the executive team to ensure the right procedures are in place, to facilitate the communication, to teach the skills for leaders to have safe conversations and hold safe space for each other and effectively communicate messages and work through when people have concerns or work through any challenges, or issues. So to me, there's kind of like two components. One is driving the system, making sure that we were like I was studying CDC, OSHA, watching multiple press releases every day, press conferences every day. We needed to be the subject matter expert in guiding the system, but also facilitating the emotional, the psychological safety and the communications of all of this, with our teams.
This brings to mind something. Richard brings this up in the audience, and it was one of the questions that I really wanted to hear from you all is staffing, which is when it comes to the role of safety having grown over the last year, right? In particular, do you feel like the restaurant industry in particular tends to play more lean on the HR side, and that's changed? How do you think about staffing with safety and DE&I and other initiatives really taking front stage at businesses now? Are new roles being created in your org, or is the role itself just changing?
I mean, I can kind of start. I think that, it's interesting because I do think food and beverage tends to be lean all around, right? Just in general, you're working with, really kind of low margins, and you're trying to kind of hit a number, and it's lean in general, just the overall kind of finances of that business. So I think comparatively to probably other organizations, I do think it tends to lean on the lean side, no pun intended. And, I think with COVID too, kind of even going back to your prior question about like what transpired during COVID and how was that, a big part in terms of HR and what part they played. I think back to kind of the beginning, which feels like ages ago, but, last March, and kind of what was transpiring, and, how for myself and our organization and what we did, it was a very collaborative effort, where I do think my role was to support the organization and to have collaborative conversations with the leaders of the business to say, how do we think and balance all these things that we don't really know? I mean, I remember in March 2020 where, part of the direction was don't wear masks, right? Like leave masks for, PPP equipment for our medical personnel. And that quickly evolved to, okay, everyone should wear a mask. And so you almost had this day-to-day change of what was happening that you had to keep up on, right? And then be able to balance, okay, well, how do we do this from a business perspective? How do we give guidance to make sure it's being done appropriately? And it was changing almost every 24 hours, right? So you kind of had to just be constantly in my word of the industry is in flux. I feel like there's so much going on all at once that you have to manage to, but going back to the leanness of the organization, that from us anyway didn't change. If anything, it became a little leaner. So you're managing to all these initiatives that are happening, but your business has lower traffic, you have lower volume, or for the most part, kind of I think in totality, and you have to figure out how to use your resources resourcefully, and make sure that you can still get to all these things at a very high level, but you didn't have a lot to work with. I mean, I think I would say that for a lot of people I've also heard in this industry, that their teams just got cut, if as well, in support. We were a little bit lucky that it wasn't tremendous in our company in general, but I do think it's something that you have to end up figuring out how you do. And there's not a lot of resources that you can layer on to be able to help you get there.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
No, please, David.
I think both of those are spot on. As I was reflecting as they were talking, I think in every organization that I've either consulted with or have friends who work in, HR is super lean. What it does is it allows for, if you look at the positive side, for people to become real Renaissance players, right? They get to learn a whole lot of skill sets that they can bring to the table, which for some people is a positive. For like probably everybody on this call, they're curious, they like to learn, they want to grow. And so I think you have that. And to Michelle's point, that we got leaner. I think all organizations got leaner during the pandemic. And I loved Rachel's comment about, reading on the CDC and everything. I mean, we became experts in vectors of viruses and how they worked, right? I mean, the day that the index person crawled into our vernacular, I actually took a step back. My sister's a microbiologist, and was like, do you talk about like that stuff, right? And she's like, yeah, what are you doing? It's like, well, it's how does the virus get in and where does it go, right? And so you have to learn all of those things and adjust quickly, right? And develop training and develop content, and you become the de facto expert, right? So, people are calling me and they're saying, what's the CDC's guidance on this? And I was like, well, I know what it was yesterday. Has it changed? Because it did change. I think Rachael said that it changed all the time. And now, I think one of the other questions is probably coming is with the changing legislation now around safety, right? California, of course, DC, everybody's got their new OSHA guidelines. And we're running hard to make sure that we are aware of what the changes are, that our restaurants are compliant, that they understand. And in some cases, it's just, it's a minor change from what we've done before, but we've got to stay on top of it. And so you combine that lean with everything's changing so quickly that it's invigorating, I think is probably the word that I would use around that.
I would agree with that, because I think to tag on to what you're saying there is, it is invigorating. I mean, while it's super challenging, no doubt. I mean, this has been devastating for businesses. It was the rug pulled out from underneath everyone, right? When you're down like that in a matter of 3 days. But it also is it's kind of our thinking was like, let's never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Exactly right.
Not my quote. That's a history quote. And it's an opportunity for such rapid evolution, because while you do have to a lot of us went through, reductions across the company. We also had opportunities to break out of old marketing models and marketing ways of spending dollars. You learn, okay, well, digital, this is a whole different space, the rapid acceleration of digital. You see, okay, well, do people really need to be in an office or not? And where can we, so there's a whole organizational evolution that can happen, where the HR team can decide and think about what competency does HR really need to have in this organization? Do we need to be doing, payroll and this and that, or are there ways to dramatically, elevate our game around strategically and, get rid of the stuff that we don't need to be doing that's not value added, continue to evolve the organization and allocate resource against what's going to drive the biggest ROI, and really lean into what's the value that we're bringing to the organization and do more of that versus some of the transactional work. So it's hard, but I think that there's a way to evolve. And my last comment would be is that the initiatives you were talking about, DE&I and staffing, et cetera, those are not HR initiatives. Those are business initiatives. and it is shared responsibility. You're the driver and leader of it, kind of the work streams around it, but there are business initiatives, and it's a team of leaders working together to accomplish that strategic plan. I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I just got chills, Rachel. And it's so this is an incredibly interesting point when it comes to, and I want to come back to DE&I too, as we think about those company initiatives. But you've all mentioned this word resources, and I think one of the obvious resources is technology, right? I was doing some reading, and the Harvard Business Review was talking about the Great Recession a decade ago, and that the businesses that were more severely affected by the Great Recession were more likely to invest in new technology. And while that technology may have helped replace some forms of routine jobs, it actually ended up increasing the demand for new roles and, more importantly, new skills. And so I think that the misconception that folks have about technology is this is just going to replace my people, but it's actually helping create efficiencies
right.
in the business. And so I'm curious to hear, we hear about the CEO and the COO having a strong role in technology. What role are you playing in technology these days? I know that you're surfing the internet every morning, reading the CDC website, but I have a hunch there's more to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more to it, and you'd ask this question, what's the role of technology and where's it going to go? I mean, it's the future. The future is digital. I mean, we have to be there. We have to be digitally savvy, and I don't think it would be too far of a stretch to say that that's not where restaurants are people to people, right? It's hospitality, right? So there's a resistance to some forms of technology. But I think that digital can really help. I mean, Rachel made the excellent point about automating some of the tasks and getting rid of some of those things. Sure, but I think the ability to have intelligence and data that you can use to make informed decisions, strategic decisions about what should we be doing, that is going to become more, it's already important. I think it's going to just escalate. And it's the opportunity to connect across, right, the different functions of the organization. So you really do have some intelligence coming out of your organization. What's the impact of this? How can we track the results of these things, right? So we mentioned DE&I. The first thing is, how are you doing in your DE&I, right? What's the current state of the makeup of my team? Where do we want to go? How do we do that? How do we find where people are getting stalled, right? So that we can eliminate barriers to that. So I think that the technology and the digital piece is absolutely the wave of the future. And I'm not the first person to say that. So I'll stop and let my peers hop in as well.
But it sounds like you're saying it's an if and only, right? This technology only matters if it's providing the insights necessary to make better, more strategic decisions. So just plopping something into place is probably not the best decision. No. You're actually doing the diligence. Yeah.
Yeah. Technology for technology's sake is not going to work, right? I mean, I go back about a year and a half to when I was having conversations with our IT team, and we were talking about Microsoft Teams, right? I'd used that in a former employer and found it to be a good tool for us to use, and really was one of the few people who was using Microsoft Teams. Well, fast forward to the middle of March, and that's how we're doing everything, right? Everything is a Microsoft Teams event or a Zoom event or something like that, right? So before it was just that, well, we have access to this thing. Now it adds incredible value because it allows us to connect to each other and to see each other, right? And so that now I've got all the real positives around, okay, I can actually see your face and we can be more connected than on a conference call or on a Zoom call or a Teams call where everybody's got their cameras off, right? Because there's a human component to it. And I think that's, ironically, the digital transformation allows us to be more connected as people.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also, I think that there's technology plays such an important part in the efficacy, the effectiveness of the organization. And so when you're strategizing around, okay, well, I'm running 5% G&A, or I've got a 6% G&A budget, whatever that is, I've got to be strategic around what's the infrastructure, what's the evolution, is that delivering what we need? And I totally agree with you, David, especially with the explosion of virtual brands and the digital e-commerce space, the right analytics at the right time across functions, HR, marketing, finance, et cetera, the right intelligence and the right systems that enable people to execute better, faster, stronger is very critical for the HR leader to be part of that strategy and driving that.
Yeah. And it drives a collaborative approach, right? I mean, and that I think that's the path of the future, right? We've got to be more collaborative so we can be more nimble, we can be more agile. Yeah, and to the extent that you're not leveraging technology for that, I think you're falling behind, further and further behind.
Yeah, to that point, I think the piece that I've experienced actually very recently, we were very ambitious in 2020 in terms of where our company's going through a lot of evolution of change, and we had multiple implementations that were going on at the same time. And I think what ended up happening that from an HR perspective, and kind of tying into what Rachael and David are saying, was that what I learned is that a big part that we play, or HR plays, is also thinking about our people, right? The end user of all of these technology, and being able to kind of have this collaborative conversation around what it means, because you'll have, maybe something that was happening in accounting and finance with one implementation, and another for our franchise partners, and another, I had two in HR with payroll and time and attendance, and they all overlap. And in the end, they impact, again, our people, the end users, and sometimes just even, helping the organization look at it from a broad scope of saying, okay, let's make sure we're thinking about, do these systems talk to each other? Is it making our people's lives easier or more difficult? And so, that's another part of where I think we play a very influential role, and being able to really hopefully help our partners, our business partners, be able to look at it from a different perspective, because each department kind of has a goal of what they're trying to execute with technology. And I feel like we play our part in kind of pulling that all together, and making sure we don't forget who the end users are.
Yeah, it's great.
I think that point is so poignant, especially now when we are all technology facing. Managers, sous chefs are thrown in front of Zoom screens, and they never before. And frontline teams are expected to get onto those Zoom calls too, from their homes, where have you. There's a lot of change happening. And so thinking about that end user at all times, I can imagine it never really occurred to me what role your function plays in actually ensuring that everyone's taking that into consideration company-wide. With that in mind, I do want to peel back a little bit to something, Rachael, that you had pointed out earlier. Let's talk a little bit about the role of DE&I as it relates to the company and also to the HR function. We are seeing new roles emerge, right? Not only on the DE&I side, we're seeing employee experience roles start to come to the surface. Somebody who's not just a field HR manager, they're actually thinking about that entire employee care. And on the same token, when it comes to new roles, we're seeing DE&I roles really take shape quickly in organizations. What has been your experience? And I'm going to say this from the lens of, this is something we talked about before the call, is there any impact in your type of organization, right? Your multi-unit groups, your full service, or your bakery and sandwich, your how does that vertical impact those decisions when it comes to like size, right? And staffing, and also, of course, the importance of having that role long-term, and what does it mean now? That was a very big question, but it is a big
There's
question.
Like 7 questions in there, Rachael.
No,
Which one do you want us to go after first?
Well, I bring it up only because there's so many different approaches to take. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is an important topic in restaurants. We all know the systemic issues that we're all really addressing right now in the industry. And so, Rachael, I see you nodding. Maybe we can toss it to you first, as far as like what roles you're seeing at Smokey Bones, and just what your point of view is.
Sure. I think, when you talk about the field HR manager and you talk about roles, I think actually that is an employee experience role. And I think, frankly, HR, the traditional HR really is, that we're about human capital, right? It's about the employee and driving what's going to unleash their, potential towards business objectives. So to me, HR plays a critical role in that. And as does the entire team. It is a business, it's a business component. Because diversity, we all know the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it's a growth strategy. It's a business success strategy. So, for us, we focused very much on our culture and very much on our core values, one of which is be yourself. And we've leaned in and defined what we call human-centric leadership and what that means and how, and then we're teaching and building that capability around human-centric leadership, because to us, that is fundamental to inclusiveness. It's everyone who shares our core values, by the way. So, there is if this isn't important to you, not the right place for you, if you don't value people and celebrate what makes us unique as well as what bonds us, then this isn't the right place for you. But, just galvanizing people around that and that inclusiveness and opening the door for conversations and having honest, real conversations. We did not focus around, we're like, we thought and we debated a lot, like, do we do a public statement? Do we do a big thing? And ultimately what we did was we talked to our teams very directly, very openly, very consistently. And we have honest, ongoing dialogue and work and focus around how we bring people into the party at all levels of the organization, on all of the on all the decisions we make. We have internal brand ambassadors that come in that, we talk to and that are part of all of our initiatives and how we shape them. So we really lean in on inclusiveness, the importance of inclusiveness, creating a safe environment to talk about these issues and to talk about what people's experience are. And then then it's about hardwiring some things in, right? Looking at the statistics. How equitable are we? Is there implicit bias at play anywhere? What do our diversity numbers look like? And how do I train now leaders around this to elevate it in our organization? So I think it's it's multidimensional.
Yeah, I'd love to, Rachael, you actually said something when you first started about, that you started your career as kind of in the kitchen, and it was kind of, this is one of the industries where it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, what, where you come from. It is one of those, industries that you really can move your way up. And for a lot of companies, right, move your way up based on your performance. And, I agree with everything you said about culture, because I think that's really where it kind of starts. And the other part I would add, because I agreed with everything you said, would be leadership, which you touched upon. And for us, and the other Rachael, I know we talked about this with CEOs and the partnership, but I also think it stems from really the CEO and to me, like my role, in terms of a really collaborative, consistent point of view of what it means. And, for us, it really is about culture and how you treat people. And we are about people first. And you're right. If you don't fit into that, part of our culture, it becomes very apparent very quickly, right? How you treat people, how you lead your teams, how you develop them, how you recognize them, how you reward them, how you hold them accountable. If you really create that consistently in your organization and have fairness in how you do that, then that takes care of the diversity, the inclusion, the equity, because it's just an inherent part of what you do. And so it's not a statistic you have to work for or a number you have to look at. I think it becomes such a huge part of your culture that it's second nature in terms of what you do, because we aren't looking at who you are, where you came from, what you look like. None of that matters other than what you bring to the table and how you perform and how you fit into our culture. And I think for us, that's the huge part of what we're working towards. You know, and I think diversity, inclusion, and equity become kind of a side effect to, you know, when you do that well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to build on what Michelle just said, because I think the idea of it being a side effect, right, is important to pay attention to, right? So I always go back to, what's your why behind it, right? So what are you trying to accomplish, right? So there is a real risk in some organizations, certainly not the ones that are people who are on this call, of DE&I being a me too. Well, everybody's got one, so I got to go get one, right? I got to go have a role of that, right? Because, and I don't know what to do with it, but it's become a tick the box, right? So now I have somebody whose job is DE&I, right? And I think that what I'm hearing from the other two folks, Michelle and Rachel, is it's part of your culture, right? So, you know, I'm blessed to be part of a 55-year-old brand that is founded on creating a sense of belonging, right? And so that's what we're all about, right? And so it's a natural extension. And I think if you come at it from that sense, you capture a lot of the excellent points that Rachel has identified, as well as Michelle. It's about, you know, we're trying to create a place where people can feel good about being part of this culture, right? And so as leaders in the strategy of the organization, if that's part of your strategy, I think you're on the right track, right? So I think it starts with, why are you trying to do this? What's the why behind it? And I go back to something Rachel said early on. It's a strategic issue. It's an organizational issue. It's not an HR issue, right? And I think we just need to be very careful about what's the why behind it. And, you know, if you're going to get what you're going to reap the benefits of what you're going after, right? So if I'm doing this because I've been told I have to, you're going to have a very different result than if it's part of your DNA, part of your culture, part of what you're really trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought of that I wanted to add is that, because I've seen this, as David described, done differently in other companies that I've worked in, right? Where it becomes, it's such a, for them by itself an initiative, but they don't really understand the why. So it ends up being something that is not as impactful. And the thing that I've realized that, I make sure we don't do at our company is, I think it's really important HR, not rubber stamp decisions, right? Whether it's around hiring and who you want to hire, who you want to promote. Sometimes you do have HR partners who feel like, I have to say yes because this executive wants me to say yes to a promotion, but I'm not helping them understand, well, why are we giving this one person a promotion versus someone else? Why are you hiring this candidate versus someone else? And so on the flip side, I think that's something HR should pay attention to, that you're not in a role where you're, again, kind of just rubber stamping decisions, and that you do feel good about what some of those decision making, by executives look like, because that's where you can kind of fall off track, no matter what your intention is, in terms of what you're trying to accomplish.
This is a really interesting topic. It kind of makes me think about what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, which is HR is the misconceptions about the role of chief people officer, and how it really historically has been seen as like the check the box role too. And how like the main function of this role is to keep the business compliant. But compliance and the definition of compliance has dramatically expanded. And there is no one definition for it. There are several different components of what that means, whether it's on like the human level of, are we maintaining our own metrics? Are we paying attention to what matters to us as an organization, to the things that matter, to the federal government and local governments, which is the obvious piece, but you're bringing up the people piece of compliance, which is so much mushier and more important, arguably, and harder to you can't get it done in a day. It takes a long time to really lock in all of those components. We have already almost run through 50 minutes here. I had one more question, and then I wanted to I wanted to flip it over to a final question here. And just to everybody who's watching, please feel welcome to toss in a comment or a question into the chat. We'd love to toss it to the panel. Jamie Johnson says, if the approach for DE&I is coming from a compliance perspective, I believe it won't be successful. And the why is extrinsic versus intrinsic. And I'm curious to hear if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, I would be willing to argue that I think that's essentially what we've said, right? Which is there is a, if it is a, if it's there for a compliance, I've got to have one, or to keep score or something, that you're going to have very different results than if it's coming from a place that I think we all embrace, which is it's about inclusion, it's about creating the sense of belonging, it's about a culture thing, and it's a strategic business thing. So I think that's I agree with her 100%. I think that's what we're saying.
So I'm gonna bring this in a little bit. I like to come into, if I were somebody who didn't know anything about HR, and we're walking into this room right now, was in the food industry forever, was thinking about this, maybe I'm a new CEO, maybe I'm a new COO in the restaurants, I've been around this function, but I'm not sure. I wanted to toss this interesting study to you and get your thoughts on it. Feel free to push back. So there was a Cornell study that showed that the three most common areas of functional experience for HR executives were talent management, compensation and benefits, and culture. Do you agree with that survey based on your own experience? That those are the three components of an executive HR role?
I can go. I would have to say I agree with 2/3 of it. For me, I have grown up in very large companies. I worked for Macy's, for Liz Claiborne, Phillips Van Heusen. And I was lucky enough to see what great looked like on the benefits and payroll side, but I hadn't been exposed to it myself to manage those functions or to do benefits or payroll. It was, not part of what I find to be in my skill set of expertise. So for me personally, I don't know if I would agree with those three. For me, I think it is definitely talent and all aspects of talent, right? From recruitment to talent, retention to pipelining and succession planning and, executive coaching and helping your leaders be better leaders. So like everything under talent, I think is huge. For me, it's also been employee relations. I think I have a strength in employee relations that just helped me in retail. We all know retail is, the most exciting, industry for employee relations. We have the best stories if you ever talk to us about, right, employee issues. So I think, for me, it's also been employee relations. And then, I've had to learn the payroll and benefit side in the role that I'm in now, but it was something that I definitely was able to learn. I think you then build teams that help you with that, right? So you get a strong partner, and that's where your teams become really important. And then, I guess if I had to pick a third one, it would be org design, and kind of really being able to look at an organization and be able to say, what do you need right now from a people perspective? What do you need a year from now, 5 years from now? How to look at the strategic plans of the company and be able to make recommendations about what that should look like. So I guess those would be my three if I kind of had to pick three right now. And I'm sure there are more, but those are the big ones that I think in my role right now that become really impactful in terms of my experience and what has helped me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that I would agree that that's, in some instances, for some companies, that's what they need. So in the more traditional HR, kind of organizations, you would have somebody who's got some of those traditional pieces. Comp and benefits is probably one, because that's, you're managing or you're leading a pretty significant area of the P&L, in terms of that cost. But what I see in the more progressive places, and in my experience, it's been more around the business experience, and to see, an executive. The difference between functional leading and executive is that broader business I'm on this executive team making business decisions, driving the strategy of the business. And so I think you see people that have some little less traditional HR backgrounds going into those roles, learning enough about the competencies to be dangerous, and be able to execute the function, but that have broader business experience. Certainly in my case, that's the case.
Yeah, and I think that's mine is similar to that, Rachel. And I think what Michelle said is you have to have an awareness of it. You have to have the right leaders in that part of the business so that you can capitalize on that as you are driving organizational strategy, right? So I think if there was a piece that I think that I would add, and maybe this is what Rachel is saying, is it's strategy, right? It's having a sense of what is strategy. How do you put the pieces and the parts together to accomplish where you're going, right? You hear lots of things that people will say, talent strategy or people strategy. And I think if you ask 50 people, what is that? You're going to get at least 47 different answers. But if it's not tied to what's the strategy of the business, I think you're missing something, right? So I think it's the ability to understand strategy, to think the way that your CEO thinks, your CFO thinks, your COO thinks. That to me is a huge benefit.
And you're bringing up this point, the notion of when I got into HR, it was the same thing. This misconception of like, okay, I thought this was a functional role. I thought that this was the thing I was going to do every day. I was going to make sure boxes were checked. I was going to make sure that I was hiring 400 cooks when we were opening this restaurant, and that is 10% of the job. The other 90% of it is so, and I know that we're using the word strategic, and that's a whole other webinar, how to set strategy as a CHRO, but it really does come down to understanding what eyes you have on the business and what partnerships you're building with all of the executive leaders in order to help cover all of that cultural ground, as well as all of course, the compliance pieces. This brings me to our last question. Speaking of strategy and vision, so I want to hear, and I think everyone else here is interested to hear, if I could, throw a crystal ball through the screen now and have you catch it. We are in a very strange time. And so I don't think we need to pinpoint too much of that. We all know it's weird, and that we're working through it together. What happens in 2030 with your job in the restaurant industry? Is there still a CPO? Has it evolved into something else? It's already evolving, but where do you think it's going to be?
Great question.
Set vision with me in 4 minutes, please.
Yeah, so I think if it doesn't evolve, we've wasted opportunity, right? So Rachel, what did you say? Never waste a good crisis. I think the industry is evolving, going to continue to evolve. That's a given. If you don't think that's the case, I think you're smoking the front lawn or something. And so it has to evolve. Where is it going to go? I mean, my own bias, I think it's going to be shifting towards more collaboration at all levels of the business, right? And so part of our role is how do we foster that? How do we select, retain, develop people who can do that? To have, Richard pointed something out about budgeting and finance, who are thinking in a particular way, thinking as business owners, so that we can create more empowered leaders, right? And really drive a level of collaboration. The world is not going to slow down, I don't believe. I think it's, we all talk about being nimble and agile. I think that's going to be the price of entry. We're going to have to be more nimble. We're going to have to be more agile. You cannot do that in a command and control culture. It has to be collaborative. And I think that, to me, is where a big emphasis ought to be played, is shifting the entire enterprise to learning how to work collaboratively. And I think that's going to become part of the price of entry for any member, essentially a strategic leader in the business. You've got to be able to do that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, Rachel. I agree 100%. And I think, a couple of things that I would add, I think also playing a part in innovation, right? Which also is tied into change and constantly thinking about what do we do better? What do we do differently? How do you kind of think about what's going to happen, which we don't know, but, we obviously learned in 2020, a lot could happen, in a space of a minute. So I think it's this constant kind of, also to what David said about collaborative effort and really being able to collaborate with the business to do that, but also weigh in on change and innovation. And the other part that I would add is talent, right? I think we're seeing it now. I think it's even though unemployment is at such a high rate, it's still very challenging to find talent for some strange reason. I think I know what it is, but I won't say. But, I think that talent piece also becomes really important, right? What does talent for the future look like? How do you really, again, be innovative and think about kind of future thinking in terms of who you bring into the organization? So it's not just talent who can do the job for now, but can the talent do the job for a year from now, 5 years from now, right? Like you really want to be very forward thinking about, I think, those components. So I would add those two things.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And to me, the future role of the CPO and where we're kind of all talking about is driving org effectiveness. When I think about the org, I kind of am a big fan of the Jake Galbraith model. I follow that: strategy, structure, process, people, rewards, that we're driving that, because that's the outcome of that. Honestly, that drives a lot of culture, that drives the employee experience, that drives the performance of the business, and continuously evolving, refining, becoming more agile, getting the systems, the processes, the right talent strategy. All of that is part of that org effectiveness. And I think CPOs really play a leading role in driving the effectiveness of the overall organization.
And and I wonder, when you're saying collaborative, do you all mean that this is basically not gonna, it almost seems like the role over the last 10 years has really become less of this siloed function, and it's much more, there's more homogeneity among like HR and the rest of the restaurant group. And it's almost like that's going to continue to happen, especially given everything that we've talked about over the past hour. All of you are wonderful. I love you all. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, everyone, to all of our viewers here. We had folks on LinkedIn Live watching, and I know folks right here in the Zoom room as well. Great questions. If you are interested, we'd love to hear from you around what other topics. Go into the chat, take a quick survey, answer a question, get a free tote. Can't lose. We love giving away free stuff at Opus. So please take the survey. We'd love to hear from you. Rachel, David, Michelle, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your Thursday afternoon with us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you, Rachel. David.
It was great.
Nice to meet you, Rachel. And Mitch.
Nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you all.
All right, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.